you all here in this room a question. How many have heard that Israel's territory in any way is violating international law? Has anyone heard that that they're illegal settlements? Yeah. All right. How many people in the room actually think that Israel does have illegal settlements or that they're violating international law with their territory? One, okay. Anyone else? Two, anyone else? Okay, so now I'll ask the same question that I asked in Brussels. You think they're probably violating international law?
Yes.
All right, which one?
151 and
151?
that's no 222.
222.
I don't remember the number, but that's the
That's the resolution.
that's the resolution, right?
Okay, but that's after the State of Israel.
After the State of Israel,
Yeah, 222.
222 was after 67.
Right, and they're, all right, and what do you think is the law that they're that's not international law as much as a UN resolution. Well, actually not. The General Assembly, when it makes a like 181, which I'll discuss, is different from the Security Council. So when the UN makes a resolution, it's not binding. It's suggestive. Just like when the Senate makes a resolution, it's suggestive. Only when the Security Council makes a resolution does it have the force of law. Let's ask this gentleman. What law do you think, what part of international law is being violated?
I don't have a specific section, but it appears that there might, from what I hear, at least one side, it sounds like an encroachment.
Encroachment on what?
The lands might be set aside for Palestinians. If I'm wrong, correct me, please.
Okay. So let's talk about the land. First, we all know that in biblical times, Israel was known as Judea, correct? And when the Romans expelled the Jews, they changed the name of the land from Judea to Palestine, correct? And the word Palestine means?
I have no idea.
No idea. Philistines. Right. They changed the name of the land to the greatest enemy of the Jews, the Philistines. In addition, they denuded it of any independence or as an independent nation, and they attached it to Syria, and they called it Syria-Palestina. So the Romans ruled Palestine as Syria-Palestina as a southern province or part or region of Syria. Now let's move ahead and let's talk about the next guys who have an important role, and that's the Ottoman Empire. That's the Turks. Does everyone in the room know what the Ottoman Empire was? Does anyone not know what the Ottoman Empire was? All right. Anyone has heard of Turkey? Before it was Turkey, it was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ruled on 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe, for approximately, let us say, in the case of Palestine, about 440 years. And the Sultan owned all the land. And in the mid-19th century, let us say specifically April 28th, 1858, somewhere around there, there were a series of land reforms and individual rights that were installed, and they allowed people for the first time in the Ottoman Empire to register their land as land that they owned. And that means that if they owned a piece of land, by whatever right, they could register it in the deeds office the same way you might register your land in the county office of deeds. And in order to have that right, they had to work the land, live on the land, own the land, or have some other attachment to the land. And the 400 and some page Ottoman Land Registration Act, which I have a copy of in English, and there are very few in the world, stipulated the same types of rules and regulations that we have here in New Jersey, that we have here in Maryland. It was actually based on English law, and it said there were several categories, and one of those categories was that if land was abandoned, left fallow, not worked, then it is cheated back to the state. So that meant that a person, let's say an Arab, could not just stand in the valley and say, I see all these hilltops around me, and say, these are mine. He had to have some connection to those. And does everybody in the room know what is cheated back to the state means? Any lawyers in the room? Anyone who was formerly married to a lawyer? This guy was married. Okay. All right. Here, move up here a little bit. You're doing a good job. You're raising your hand with a lot of questions. All right. You can't touch the mic. What is cheated?
As cheated means that if, under certain circumstances, land can go back to the government if it's not in use.
Sovereign lands.
Sovereign land.
Okay, now, does everybody know that if you don't put $5 in your savings account from time to time, it's going to go back to the... Now, here in Jersey, I understand it's a long time. In Maryland, where I'm from, it's just 1 year. So we have to make sure we put $5 in our savings account, or it gets cheated back to the state within a year. Okay. Now, where did the Arabs mainly live in the land of the mid-19th century that Mark Twain said was almost deserted in many parts? They lived mainly in the valleys. That means these were the places where the herds could be tended, the crops could be harvested. It was green, there was water there, they had streams, and this was where habitation took place. Where they didn't settle was they didn't settle up on the hilltops, generally speaking, not always, because the hilltops were not arable. You could not grow stuff up there. They were rocky, they were unusable. So, after 10 years of non-use, this land went back to the Sultan, back to the Ottoman Empire, as what they called public lands, wastelands, or other lands not needed for public purposes, okay? That's the Ottoman Land Registration Act. Now, has anyone in the room actually heard, before this moment, of the Ottoman Land Registration Act? No. You have, right? And you have. Okay. So now we move about 20 years after the Ottoman Land Registration Act, and Turkey, meaning the Ottoman Empire, passes the Vilayet law, the law of the Vilayets, and it now has administrative districts, and those administrative districts include Syria and Palestine, or Syria-Palestina, along the Roman model, is part of that. Moving on, so now we're into the good 1870s, and moving a few years more, we discover that we have a new phenomenon, or a building phenomenon, in the world called self-determination. Has everybody in the room heard of self-determination? You've heard of self-determination? You've heard of self-determination. And that means that individuals, based on their common religion, their common geographic location, their common language, whatever they think binds them together, whether it's the fact that they're speaking a certain language or they're living between the two valleys, they could self-determine their own affairs instead of being dictated to by ecclesiastical, dynastic, and monarchical regimes in the far-off empires. And this, of course, self-determination brings up the corollary issue of nationalism. Nationalism means people wanted to make their own national destiny, destiny and not be ruled by the far-off dictators, either whether it was the Tsar or whether it was the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan. So now many groups are looking for self-determination. That would be the Greeks, the Hungarians, the Armenians, and the Jews wanted self-determination, and there was Jewish nationalism. And Jewish nationalism created what? What? Zionism. That is the two-word definition for Zionism, is Jewish nationalism. In fact, at the time that Jewish nationalism arose, in the late 1990s, 1890s, say 1897, when the First Zionist Congress was called, they weren't even sure it would be Palestine, that they would be self-determining their national aspirations in. As you know, many locations were under consideration. Palestine was always the very top of them, but others were determined. Now, many people think that it was, in fact, the advent of Herzl and Judenstaat, his book for a Jewish state, or it was the push of modern Zionism that actually was the main engine for this movement. Actually, the big engine did not occur in 1897. It occurred in 1903. And in 1903, we have the Kishinev pogrom. Has everybody in the room heard of the Kishinev pogrom? You've heard of the Kishinev pogrom?
Yes, there's a program that happened in Russia or Ukraine.
It was in Eastern Europe. It's hard to say what was Russia and what was not Russia because the lines were going back and forth. This was the very first pogrom, and there were many, the very first pogrom which had ever been broadcast to the world immediately. Kishinev, K-I-S-H-N-E-V, Kishinev. And K-I-S-H-N-E-V, you like N-I-V?
I-N-E-V.
I-N-I-V, Kishinev, okay. I suppose it depends what part of Poland you've been brought up in. This was broadcast to the world, this terrible atrocity. There were hundreds of pogroms. But in this particular pogrom, which was an Easter pogrom, the Jewish victims had their stomachs ripped open and stuffed with pillows. They were burned, there were rapes, there were all sorts of bloody elements of a massacre. And this was all broadcast around the world due to a brand new communications modality. And the name of that communications modality was what?
Radio,
Radio. No. Try again.
newspaper,
Newspaper. No. Try again.
telegram,
Telegram. You're getting closer. Try again.
telegraph,
Telegraph. No. Wire service. First wire service. And the name of that first wire service was?
Reuters.
Reuters. Correct. Reuters wire service. So all of a sudden, the whole world, meaning all the newspapers suddenly, and of course then they sent their own journalists in, could document this atrocity, and many people began to see that the Jews who were not wanted in Russia, were being massacred in Russia, needed a homeland of their own. And this plugged into the concept of Zionism, which modern Zionism had been born some years before, at the end of the 19th century. And it's an interesting side note that one of the groups that was moved to help the Jews was the Chinese Benevolent Society of San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. The Chinese, also through Manchuria and some of their kinfolk, were also fighting the Tsar, so they had a natural affinity to the tragedy of the Jews. They donated money, they sent relief help, and actually in New York, on one Christmas Eve, they invited all the main Jewish leaders to join them for a Chinese meal in a Chinese restaurant called Chinese Delmonico's. And these Jewish leaders couldn't read the Chinese menu, and they just ordered by number, 1, 3, 4. And ever since that time, the Jews have been going to Chinese restaurants on Christmas. You know, when you do this kind of research, you leave out 99% of what you find, and this is one of the 99% I decided not to leave out. Now, it's interesting. All the stuff I'm giving you about international law does not appear in the book, Financing the Flames, which you saw on, which is my most recent bestseller. This is the research I had to do to be prepared to understand the issues confronting Israel and NGOs, was to become conversant with the realities of international law. Okay. So now we're moving ahead, and from 1903, and we get to 1908. 1908, we see the advent of Arab nationalism, and that is done through the Young Turk movement. Has everyone heard of the Young Turks? The concept of the Young Turks? These were Young Turks, Turkish soldiers, influenced by the French Christian leadership that they encountered in Lebanon and Syria. Pardon me? Lawrence comes in later. And I will take questions from everybody after this is done. So they also wanted their national aspirations. They wanted an Arab state, since, of course, the Turks were not Arabs, and had a lot of conflict with the Arabs. And they wanted that, they were determined to create an Arab state in what part of the world?
Middle East.
Middle East, where?
Syria.
Syria, correct. They wanted the Arab state to be in Syria, in Damascus, which was the center of gravity for the Arab world. And of course, Hussein, who was the Sharif of Mecca, and his son Faisal, who participated in this Lawrence of Arabia story that is 81% accurate that you've seen in the movies, attacking the trains in exchange for what they thought would be their national rights in Syria. Now we're moving into World War I, 1914 and beyond. And now Germany is at war with France and England, and of course their allies. And who is allying with Germany? Turkey, correct, the Ottoman Empire. That means that the Ottoman Empire is now at war with the Western Allies. So immediately, almost immediately, the Turkish authorities decide to exterminate all the Jews of Palestine because, of course, they thought they were enemies of the state in the same way that they thought the Armenians were enemies of the state. In the case of the Armenians, 1.4, 1.5 million Armenians were systematically massacred and murdered on death marches in the first genocide of the 20th century. It's hard to use the word genocide since the word didn't exist until 1942, but you understand what I mean. They were murdered along the railway lines established by the Berlin to Baghdad Railway Agreement between Germany and Iraq. And in large measure, it was observed and supervised, at least from afar, by certain German officials. Now, the Jews were not exterminated in Palestine, but many of them were deported. All of this led the Allies to believe that when they won the war against the Ottoman Empire, they would dismantle the Ottoman Empire. They would, they considered the Ottomans to be, quote, the terrible Turk. And the headlines in the New York Times and the Washington Post was, we're going to carve up Turkey. That's what the headlines were. And so they decided that the colonies and territories and possessions of the Ottoman Empire would be given up to self-determination groups. Ironically, one of those groups was that wanted self-determination was Armenia. The Armenians didn't get it because we were supposed to have the mandate for Armenia, and we never joined the League of Nations. And that is why we never had the mandate. So there was as the war is coming to a close in the latter phases of the war in 1917, what began 20 years earlier in 1897 as Jewish nationalism, as national movements across the board are being readied to assume their own destiny, something is published by the major governments in the world. And this document is called what?
The Balfour Declaration.
The Balfour Declaration, right. That's a slightly different story. It involves different countries like Iraq and Syria. And so, have you heard of the Balfour Declaration?
Yeah.
Have you heard of the Talat Declaration?
No.
Anyone in the room heard of the Talat Declaration? Everybody has heard of the Balfour Declaration. Well, what is not known is that this one letter from the Foreign Office to one individual in the Jewish community expressing British policy was just a simple piece of paper. But this same policy was expressed at that same time by the Woodrow Wilson letter, the French letter, the German letter, and even the Pasha Talat Declaration of 1917 that also said, we welcome the Jews making Palestine their homeland. And of course, they would always say, in addition to the local inhabitants being allowed, not being disturbed. But the point is, these were not just one piece of paper from Balfour. This was an international policy decision taken by all the major factors in World War I. That led to something called the San Remo Convention. Now, when I was in Brussels, I asked the European Parliament experts, not just ordinary legislators and parliamentarians, experts on Palestine, what law Israel was violating. And they said, we don't know. And then I said, where does international law begin in Israel and the Palestinian territory? And nobody knew. And then I said, has anyone heard of San Remo? And one guy said, you mean mineral water? Okay, World War I ends, peace conference begins, the remapping of Europe and other parts of the world commences. The Arabs are sitting at the peace conference attempting to get Syria as their national Arab state. Faisal is in attendance. The British say okay, the French say not okay. And on March 24th, 1920, we have the bedrock of international law in that part of the world called the San Remo Convention. This international law for these purposes, without going into the UN Security Council, is created when a treaty is signed multilaterally by numerous countries. And in this case, the San Remo Convention was adopted by 59 nations. Not only was it adopted by the 59 leading nations of the world, it was ratified in the United States by both houses of Congress unanimously. And I believe, just as a coincidence, I happen to have that resolution of ratification. Would you examine it? Tell me what what year it came out.
1922?
19 when?
22.
1922, correct. So now we have a convention called the San Remo Convention, which says that the Jews will be allowed to establish their homeland in Palestine, along with the other groups that are already there. It is not only accepted by 59 nations ultimately, it becomes part of the League of Nations and is woven into the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, given by the international community to Britain, and is the law of the land each and every day for years, and goes right through and applies and is the law, the governing law, not the forgotten law, right through World War II. Now, through a strange coincidence, I happen to have a copy of the San Remo Convention here. And I'm going to ask Fern to please show it up on the screen. And I will ask somebody to read, as an example, Article 6 of the San Remo Convention.
The administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions and shall encourage, in cooperation with the Jewish agency referred to in Article 4, close settlements by Jews on the land.
Did you say close settlement by Jews on the land?
I said close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes.
Correct. Where it says state lands and wastelands not needed for public purposes, under international law, that refers to the Ottoman Land Registration Act of April 28th, 1858, which specified that lands which were not actually worked, owned, tilled, operated, would escheat back to the state, become public lands, and would either be state lands or wastelands that were not needed for public purposes. In other words, they would be empty lands, and these were mainly the hilltops. Now, you made reference, it says in here, Article 6, that this was to be made efficient through a Jewish agency referred to in Article 4. Did you not say that? I did. All right, let's go to Article 4. The name of the agency under international law, designated by 59 nations, by the League of Nations, by both houses of Congress, by the League of Nations mandate of 1922, is the Zionist Organization. This held right through World War II. And at the end, and of course in 1937, in the middle of the Hitler regime, 2 years before the war broke out, meaning the war in Europe, we had the Peel Commission, which of course laid the groundwork for 2 states for 2 peoples, and of course that created the even greater violence within the Palestine area between the Arabs and the Jews. And when World War II was over, the League of Nations was succeeded by what?
United Nations.
United Nations, correct? Everybody knows that, right? What happened to the Treaty of San Remo? Treaty of San Remo was the unfinished business of the League of Nations and was actually woven into the UN Charter. Let's go to Article 80 of the UN Charter. Read us Article 80 of the UN Charter.
Except as may be agreed upon in individual trusteeship agreements made under Articles 77, 79, and 81, placing each territory under the trusteeship system, and until such agreements as have been concluded, Nothing in this chapter shall be construed in or of itself to alter in any manner the rights whatsoever of any states or any peoples,
You said any states or peoples, correct?
states or any peoples, of the terms of existing international instruments to which members of the United Nations may respectively be parties.
Okay. So now, the League of Nations mandate and the Treaty of San Remo, adopted by 59 nations, is now woven into the UN Charter in Article 80. It's not forgotten about. They remembered it. And they remembered it, and they still kept trying to find some way, with the millions of Jews killed in the years before, with the masses of refugees, for these two communities to live side by side. That's almost the wording that they used. It is a pity, I believe, is the words they use, that these two communities cannot live side by side. And then in General Assembly, UN Resolution 181, we had the famous vote for partition, correct? And the General Assembly vote was not, was just a recommendation. There were no lines that were formulated into international law. There was suggested lines, suggested maps. In fact, in order to give the Arabs their self-determination, they cut off a complete section called Transjordan and made that a nation in the very first gasp of the mandate. And of course, they also made an Arab nation in Iraq. And that Arab nation in Iraq the king was King Faisal, who had attended the Paris Peace Con and who had actually set up an initial government of his own in Syria. And so the concept was, once again, Syria, Palestina. In fact, the Palestinians, the Arabs, if I could use that term, did not even want any recognition for the area known as Palestine, because they thought as soon as they did that and took it away from the Arab territory known as Syria, Palestina, they'd be playing the same game as the Jews, as the Zionists. So Resolution 181 says, you two communities, you'll each make independent states. There'll be some economic links, there'll be some transportation links, there'll be a common currency, and then the rest is history. The Jews said, we will make our state, and the Arabs said, you will never make your state. And can we get a map of Gaza up? Oh, we don't have it, okay. Okay, so then, Israel was the Jews were invaded on 6 sides. Jordan took the area known as the West Bank of the Jordan River. Gaza was taken over by the Egyptians. An Arab state or a Palestinian state was not created. They were absorbed. They were occupied. Moving forward, we have the 6-Day War. Nasser tried to led a coalition of Arab countries to push the Jews into the sea. That did not work. The Jews found themselves sitting at the Suez Canal, and they found themselves sitting in Shamron and the other parts of what is now known as the West Bank. That's Gaza. And the Egyptians took Gaza, and that is Transjordan, which became Jordan, and they took what is now commonly referred to as the West Bank. So that means in 1967, when the Jews found themselves in the same place that they had argued about getting in the first place, the West Bank, they found that they were in the disputed territory of the former Turkish colony called Syria Palestina. That's where they were. That there had been a sovereignty vacuum. There was sovereignty limbo going back to the end of World War I, when these territories were detached on 3 continents from the Ottoman Empire, which now was reduced to something called Turkey. And in order for them to occupy the highlands, the hills, any area, they had to observe the status quo ante and international law, which meant they had to observe the pre-existing illegal occupation law of Jordan, the pre-existing UN Charter, the pre-existing mandate for Palestine by the League of Nations, the pre-existing San Remo Convention, and going back to the Ottoman Land Registration Act of April 28th, when?
1858.
1858, correct. So then I said to these eminent parliamentarians, so which law in international law is Israel violating? And they didn't have an answer. And they said, we don't know. And these were the experts. And at the time, we had actually preceded the conversation with a discussion of SodaStream. I mean, prior to this event, this interview, I had never even heard of Scarlett Johansson. That's how out of it I am. And I said, so let me get this straight. You've got a piece of land, you've got a factory that's environmentally good, environmentally clean. It's a few miles over the Green Line. It's got half its workforce is Arab, half its management force is Arab, equal employment, equal advancement. The Arabs are earning 4 or 5 times what they could in their own home villages. Thousands of mouths are being fed. There's a mosque on site. The halal food in the cafeteria is free, and that's a war crime, right? And they said, yes. And so I said, so if Mennonites from Lancaster were doing this, or Mormons from Utah, or Polish nuns, would they be up for a Nobel Peace Prize? And they said, probably. But I said, but Jews are doing it, so that makes it a war crime and a violation of international law. And then someone piped up and said, it's a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention. I said, really? Which chapter? Article 49. By the strangest of coincidence, I have Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention with me. Now, I'm not going to, at this time, show you all the many Jewish newspapers that have, and many organizations, NGOs, who have cited this and the language. But I will quote to you from what they say the law says. Listen carefully. Individual or mass transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power, et cetera, are strictly prohibited. Individual or mass transfers. That's right. That's the words I read in the media, and they left out the word forcible. Can you read the first 5 words of the ICRC, Fourth Geneva Convention, Article 49.
Individual or mass forcible transfers, as well as deportations of protected persons?
Right. Forcible. Where did this document come from? It came from the Tokyo draft, written in the months before. This was written by 57 experts from the Nuremberg war crimes trials, who were trying to ensure that no one ever again would transport Jews back and forth across sovereign state lines to be worked to death in concentration camps, and in the case of many, actually exterminated. It was not designed to make a war crime, giving people employment, paying them 4 times more, opening up a bus stop, and giving them a free hot meal. Article 49. You may all write this down. This is not stuff that I found in a basement archive in Switzerland. This is stuff that's common, ordinary knowledge. This is settled history. And most of our Jewish leaders don't know this history. Most of our professors don't teach this history. Most of our media doesn't report this history. And consequently, when I brought this up, and I said, so once again, what are these lands occupying, and what is the international law that they're violating? These experts, and indeed all the ones that I've spoken to, have said, we don't know. So now, does anyone in the room at this moment have an opinion of which part of international law is clearly being violated? All right, which part is that?
Again, 242 and 328, what the resolution, and we have to understand that the legitimate, and I'm not saying I'm a scholar or lawyer or anything, I'm just saying that if we consider Resolution 181 as a legitimate right for Israel and Palestine or the other people in the land to create 2 nations, we have to accept other United States
Actually,
resolutions.
those 2 resolutions called for the word refugees. Correct. Now, anyone in the room know how many refugees were created in the years after 1948 amongst the Jews expelled penniless from the Arab countries? Anyone in the room know? Over 800,000. It's 880 approximately, correct?
Correct.
And these people were thrown out of their country, penniless, stateless. Their crime was living peaceably for 2,700 years in these Arab nations, 1,000 years before Muhammad, as leading citizens. They were thrown out. The necklaces were pulled from their necks. The earrings were pulled from their earlobes, and they were sent packing on 24-hour-a-day airlifts to Israel to create a demographic bomb. Not just in one country, in many countries. And a highly documented legal disenfranchisement. And the name of the airline that had the 24-hour airlift that sent them to Israel. Anybody know the name of that airline? El Al. Who said that? Wrong. Anyone else? Alaska Air. Alaska Air. They flew the Jews. Yeah, it was Alaska Air. So they were chartered and they flew day and night. And so, it's not clear and it's not clear cut. And there's a lot of different explanations and arguments about international law and who owns the land. And then somebody said, but it's Palestinian land. And I said, what year, what decade, or what century did it become Palestinian land? And they said, we don't know. Now, I will ask anyone in the audience, in the first 6 decades of the 20th century, when you used the term Palestinian, what were you talking about, an Arab or a Jew?
A Jew.
The Jew. The Jews were the Palestinians. The Palestine Post, the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the Palestinian Brigade, as opposed to the Arab delegation, the Arab Committee, the Higher Arab Committee. And so during all those times, even if you look at Exodus with Paul Newman, as I recently did, he says to Paul Newman, what's wrong with you Palestinians? Don't you know the Arabs are going to kill you? So, and I know that all of you know that the Jews have been accused, the people of Israel have been accused of flooding Gaza with imaginary dams that don't exist in the desert in recent days, and those articles have been retracted. So I'll just finish this way, and I only have time for 1 or 2 questions because I have to catch a train, and I was enjoying myself too much. We didn't poison the wells in medieval time. We did not use Christian blood to make matzah for Passover. The Jews did not throw the Black Sox game of 1919. There was no Jewish conspiracy to remove the chips from chocolate chip cookies, as Henry Ford claimed in the Dearborn Independent. We didn't open the dams that don't exist to flood Gaza, as has been reported and now retracted by Al Jazeera and many other media. And we're not violating international law with the territory, but I'm sure that conclusion will come from a hard debate in the days to come. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. And now I've got time for 1 or 2 questions. First, I'll take a question from this gentleman. Just a second.
During the period of early Zionism, Theodor Herzl was involved, am I correct?
Theodor Herzl was early Zionism,
Early Zionism.
meaning early political Zionism.
Okay. Wasn't there a point at that point when some part of the nations of the world were offering the Jews a homeland in Uganda? And if that was true, what time period are we talking about?
Yes, they were offering Jews Uganda, Argentina, many other places, and I mentioned that specifically. And Uganda was actually briefly accepted. Let me take a question from here.
How do you bring this legal history to the media? How do you educate them so that they can provide truth?
Okay, the question, camera, is how do you bring this to the media? Well, the first thing is that when somebody misquotes the Fourth Geneva Convention and Article 49 and leaves out the key fourth word of forcible, and when somebody says it is now clearly a violation of international law, and when somebody says that this is Palestinian land, you need to say, when did it become Palestinian land? I realize that there's a lot more I could have said, but unfortunately, I can't stand here for 5 hours and give it all to you. I would love to do that. But when someone says they're violating international law by employing Arabs, you say which one. And when they say that person may not move into that house, you say because they're Jewish? Is that the test? Is that what we would allow in New Jersey, to make it illegal for a Jew to move next door, or a Muslim, or a Christian, or an atheist because of his religion? Bearing in mind there's 2 million Arabs already living in Israel as citizens, and not only do they have their rights, they just outpolled the right-wing parties, and they now have, as of a few hours ago, 13 seats in the parliament. It was diminished from 14. So all I can do is give you the benefit of 47 years of research. Actually 48. I hit my 65th birthday a couple days ago. And I'll leave it to the rest of you to figure out. Do I have time for one more? All right, Carol, do I have time for one more? Not really. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.